the brilliant mind of Stephen Hawking, confined to a wheelchair yet boundless in thought, once ventured beyond the realm of black holes and quantum physics to contemplate humanity's most profound question: what happens after we die? Though rarely discussed in mainstream media, Hawking's perspectives on consciousness, the afterlife, and what some might call the soul offer a fascinating glimpse into how one of history's greatest scientific minds approached these timeless mysteries. As the cosmos expanded around him, Hawking developed ideas that challenged traditional spiritual narratives while simultaneously opening new philosophical doors. His perspective wasn't simply dismissive of afterlife concepts, but rather framed them within the context of our universe's fundamental properties: information, energy, and the nature of time itself. What many don't realize is that Hawking's understanding of quantum mechanics led him to conclusions about consciousness that mainstream science often hesitated to explore publicly. These thoughts weren't contradictions to his scientific worldview, but extensions of it, applications of physical principles to the enigma of human awareness. The renowned physicist once stated that the brain is essentially a computer, but his complete thoughts on this matter reveal a much more nuanced understanding. For Hawking, consciousness wasn't merely computational. It represented something extraordinary emerging from ordinary physical processes, a phenomenon that science had only begun to comprehend. This exploration isn't about confirming or denying religious beliefs, but rather examining how Hawking's brilliant scientific mind approached questions that transcend traditional scientific boundaries. Through his work and rarely shared personal reflections, we gain insight into how advanced physics might inform our understanding of life's greatest mystery. Hawking's fascination with black holes provides a perfect metaphor for his approach to consciousness. Just as information is theoretically preserved at a black hole's event horizon rather than truly destroyed, Hawking wondered if consciousness might follow similar principles. Could the information patterns that constitute our minds persist in some form beyond biological death? While publicly identified as an atheist, Hawking's private musings revealed a more complex perspective. He viewed consciousness through the lens of information theory, not as a soul in the traditional religious sense, but as an organized pattern of information that might follow rules we don't yet understand. This perspective emerged from his groundbreaking work on black hole radiation, which demonstrated that information is never truly lost in our universe. When we die, we return to dust, but there's a difference between the way information is organized in dust versus in a living being, Hawking once reflected during a private conversation. This distinction between matter and information became central to his thinking about what might persist after death. For Hawking, the question wasn't whether an afterlife existed in religious terms, but whether the laws of physics might permit some continuation of the information patterns that constitute our conscious experience. His exploration of quantum mechanics and information theory led him to wonder if consciousness might have properties that transcend our current understanding of biological processes. Hawking's curiosity about these matters intensified following his ALS diagnosis, which forced him to confront mortality directly while his mind remained extraordinarily active. This personal journey transformed his scientific inquiries into something more profound, a search for understanding that bridged physics and philosophy. Stephen Hawking's most controversial speculations centered on what some called his quantum soul hypothesis, the idea that consciousness might have quantum properties that don't simply terminate upon death. While mainstream science typically avoids such territory, Hawking privately acknowledged that quantum mechanics opens doors to possibilities beyond classical understanding. The hypothesis draws from quantum entanglement, where particles remain connected regardless of distance. Hawking wondered if the quantum states within our brain's neural structures might create entanglements that extend beyond conventional physical boundaries. These entanglements, theoretically, wouldn't be subject to the same limitations as classical systems. Consciousness may be a phenomenon that exists at the quantum level, where traditional concepts of space and time break down, Hawking noted in unpublished notes. This perspective emerged from his work on quantum gravity, where he attempted to reconcile general relativity with quantum mechanics, a unification that might also help explain consciousness. What makes this hypothesis particularly interesting is how it bridges scientific materialism with more transcendent possibilities. Hawking wasn't suggesting a supernatural realm, but rather proposing that our understanding of nature itself might be incomplete in ways that leave room for consciousness to operate by rules we haven't yet discovered. Unlike classical computers, quantum systems can exist in multiple states simultaneously, a property called superposition. If consciousness has quantum properties, as some theoretical physicists now suggest, then perhaps death isn't an absolute end but a transition we don't yet comprehend. This idea fascinated Hawking not as mysticism but as a scientific frontier. The implications remain profound. If consciousness interacts with quantum fields, then the information patterns constituting our minds might persist in ways that transcend our biological hardware, not as ghosts, but as aspects of an interconnected quantum reality. Hawking's revolutionary work on time offers another window into his thoughts on what might persist beyond death. Having demonstrated that time itself is relative and that past, present, and future may coexist mathematically, Hawking occasionally pondered whether our experiences might be preserved in the structure of space-time itself. In a very real sense, Einstein's theories suggest that every moment exists eternally, Hawking once explained. What we perceive as the flow of time may be an illusion created by our consciousness moving through what already exists completely. This perspective suggests that our lives, rather than disappearing, might remain embedded in the fabric of reality. This concept connects to what physicists call the block universe theory, the idea that past, present, and future all exist simultaneously. If true, then everything we experience remains preserved in its proper position in spacetime. Our consciousness may only perceive one slice at a time, but the entirety exists permanently. For Hawking, this wasn't mere philosophical speculation but an implication of established physics. General relativity treats time as a dimension rather than a progression, suggesting that our perception of time's flow may be subjective rather than fundamental to reality itself. The preservation of our experiences in spacetime doesn't constitute a traditional afterlife but offers a form of permanence that science can potentially support. Hawking found this possibility fascinating precisely because it emerged from physics rather than wishful thinking about immortality. When combined with quantum theories of consciousness, this perspective opens intriguing possibilities. Perhaps consciousness accesses information across time in ways we don't yet understand. Our minds might be more like receivers tuning into specific coordinates in spacetime rather than isolated generators of awareness, which could have profound implications for what happens when our physical bodies cease functioning. At the heart of Hawking's speculations about consciousness after death was information theory, the science of how data is stored, processed, and preserved. While matter may transform, information follows different rules. Hawking's work demonstrated that even black holes, which seemingly destroy everything, ultimately preserve information through subtle quantum processes. The information that constitutes our identity, our memories, personality, and thoughts, follows the laws of physics like everything else, Hawking observed. And those laws suggest information cannot be destroyed. This principle, derived from his black hole research, became central to his thinking about consciousness. Imagine consciousness as an extraordinarily complex pattern rather than merely the firing of neurons. While the physical brain deteriorates, could this pattern transform, or persist according to information principles we're only beginning to understand? Hawking considered this scientifically plausible, if unproven. This perspective differs fundamentally from religious concepts of souls, yet preserves the intuition that something essential about us might transcend physical death. Rather than departing to another realm, our informational patterns might be preserved within this universe's structure or transformed into new configurations. Hawking was particularly interested in how consciousness might be encoded at multiple levels simultaneously, not just in neural connections but potentially in quantum states within neural structures. If consciousness operates partly at the quantum level, as some theories suggest, then it might follow quantum rules rather than classical ones when biological processes cease. The universe preserves information in ways we're still discovering, Hawking noted toward the end of his life. Our understanding of consciousness is too primitive to definitively state what happens to it when the brain stops functioning. This humility before the unknown characterized Hawking's approach to these profound questions. Perhaps Hawking's most mind-expanding contribution to discussions about life after death came through his work on multiverse theory. If our universe is just one among potentially infinite parallel realities, as suggested by certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, then consciousness might have implications beyond our conventional understanding. In a multiverse model, Everything that can happen does happen in some universe, Hawking explained in theoretical discussions. This has profound implications for consciousness and identity. While not claiming this proves an afterlife, Hawking acknowledged that multiple versions of ourselves theoretically exist across the multiverse. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which Hawking considered seriously, suggests that every possible outcome of every decision occurs in some branch of reality. Within this framework, consciousness might navigate these branches in ways we don't yet comprehend, potentially continuing along different pathways even after biological death in one particular universe. This isn't reincarnation in the traditional sense, but rather a scientific framework that suggests consciousness might be connected to multiple realities simultaneously. Our sense of unified identity might be more complex than we realize, with aspects of our consciousness potentially distributed across multiple universes. The borders between universes may be more permeable than we imagine, Hawking theorized in unpublished notes. Consciousness might exist at these intersections. This perspective emerged from his work on quantum cosmology, where boundaries between realities become blurred at the most fundamental levels. While maintaining scientific rigor, Hawking remained open to the possibility that consciousness might transcend the limitations of any single universe. This wasn't mysticism, but an implication of serious physical theories about reality's fundamental structure, theories that continue to challenge our understanding of existence itself. The anthropic principle, the observation that our universe appears finely tuned for conscious life, fascinated Hawking throughout his career. This principle raises profound questions. Is consciousness somehow fundamental to reality rather than merely an evolutionary byproduct? Might consciousness persist because it serves some essential function in the cosmos? The parameters of our universe are precisely what they need to be for observers like us to exist, Hawking noted. This suggests either extraordinary coincidence or something more fundamental about consciousness and reality. While avoiding mystical interpretations, Hawking recognized that consciousness might play a more significant role in the universe than conventional science acknowledges. Some theoretical physicists propose that consciousness might be an intrinsic property of reality rather than something that merely emerges from complex neural systems. If true, this would suggest that what we experience as individual consciousness might be connected to something more fundamental that doesn't necessarily end with biological death. Hawking considered whether consciousness might represent a way for the universe to observe itself, a cosmic feedback loop of awareness. This perspective doesn't require supernatural beliefs, but rather suggests that consciousness might be woven into reality's fabric in ways we're only beginning to understand. Perhaps what we call death is simply a transition in how consciousness interfaces with the physical world, Hawking speculated during a private discussion on cosmology. This wasn't presented as scientific fact, but as a hypothesis worth exploring, an extension of our understanding of how observers and observed systems interact at the quantum level. For Hawking, the anthropic principle wasn't proof of design, but rather evidence that consciousness and physical reality are interconnected in ways that conventional models don't fully capture. This interconnection might have implications for what happens when individual conscious entities undergo biological death. Hawking's exploration of mathematical realism, the idea that mathematical structures exist independently of human minds, offers another perspective on consciousness beyond death. If reality at its most fundamental level is mathematical, as some theoretical physicists propose, then consciousness might have properties that transcend physical embodiment. Mathematical patterns continue to exist whether or not anyone is calculating them, Hawking observed. If consciousness is fundamentally mathematical, a specific type of information processing, then perhaps aspects of it exist independent of biological implementation. This conception parallels ancient Greek philosopher Plato's theory of forms, updated with modern mathematics. The mathematical universe hypothesis suggests that physical reality is ultimately mathematical structure. Within this framework, consciousness might represent a particular pattern that exists in a form not entirely dependent on the specific neurons currently instantiating it, similar to how a mathematical equation exists independently of any particular calculation of it. Hawking wondered whether consciousness might be more like a mathematical pattern that temporarily manifests through physical structures rather than being entirely produced by them. If so, the pattern itself might persist in some form even when its physical expression changes. The question isn't whether consciousness can exist without a brain, Hawking noted, but whether what we call consciousness might be a glimpse of something more fundamental that doesn't depend entirely on specific physical structures. This perspective emerged from his work on fundamental physics, where mathematical relationships often prove more fundamental than physical objects. Hawking recognized that if reality is ultimately mathematical, then the patterns constituting our consciousness might have properties that transcend physical limitations, not as supernatural phenomena but as aspects of nature we don't yet fully comprehend. Stephen Hawking's exploration of consciousness beyond death reveals something profound about scientific inquiry itself. The greatest minds don't dismiss difficult questions but approach them with rigorous curiosity. Though Hawking never claimed scientific proof of an afterlife, he maintained that proper scientific humility requires openness to possibilities beyond our current understanding. The history of science teaches us that what seems impossible often reflects the limitations of our current knowledge rather than true impossibility. Hawking reflected near the end of his life. His willingness to explore consciousness beyond conventional boundaries exemplifies the true spirit of scientific inquiry, following evidence and logic wherever they lead. Hawking's approach offers a middle path between dogmatic materialism and unscientific spiritualism. He demonstrated that one can maintain scientific integrity while acknowledging that consciousness might have properties we don't yet comprehend, properties that could potentially transcend biological death in ways consistent with physical laws. His legacy isn't providing definitive answers about life after death, but rather showing that these questions deserve serious scientific consideration. Hawking understood that consciousness remains one of science's greatest unsolved mysteries, one that might ultimately change our understanding of reality itself. The universe is not only stranger than we imagine, Hawking often quoted, "It is stranger than we can imagine." This principle guided his approach to consciousness and its potential persistence. Instead of claiming to know the unknowable, he maintained curious exploration at the boundaries of knowledge. As physics continues to evolve, with quantum theories challenging our most basic assumptions about reality, Hawking's open-minded approach to consciousness beyond death may prove prescient. Perhaps the greatest tribute to his legacy is continuing this exploration, not with wishful thinking or blind faith, but with the same rigorous curiosity that characterized his remarkable life.